Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah, let's do it.
If you ask anyone, like just on the street, to describe a narcissist, they'll probably paint a pretty specific picture, right?
Absolutely. The classic caricature.
Yeah, the loud one. The arrogant boss, maybe,
Yeah.
or that acquaintance who just never stops boasting. Obsessed with status, success, how amazing they are.
And that image, that very visible, almost noisy kind of pathology, that's really dominated how we think about narcissistic personality disorder, NPD. Culturally, sure, but maybe more importantly, clinically, too.
Right. And that caricature, well, sometimes it is accurate, but it's exactly what we need to dig into and challenge today.
Exactly. Because our deep dive today is looking at a whole bunch of reports on NPD, and we're really focusing on the gender differences, how it shows up differently, how often it's diagnosed, and crucially, the diagnostic tools themselves.
Because the way we diagnose it now, mostly using the DSM-5, seems to have created this huge blind spot. It looks like there's a profound gender bias baked right in.
That's the core issue.
So our mission here is to try and understand this, well, it feels like a paradox.
Yeah.
NPD gets diagnosed mostly in men, right? The stats say men make up, what, 50 to 75% of diagnoses?
That's the number you usually see, yeah.
But the sources we're looking at strongly suggest that statistic is, deeply skewed. It's skewed because the checklist, the diagnostic framework, it seems to prioritize behaviors we tend to see more often, or maybe tolerate more often, in men.
We're basically missing a huge chunk of the picture. We need to find the pathology that the system just keeps missing.
We're going to explore this vulnerable form of narcissism. People sometimes call it covert. It seems to be the hidden face of the disorder.
And this vulnerable form, it seems to be more common in women. But, and this is the key, it masks that core entitlement with things like introversion, anxiety, being super sensitive to criticism.
So it doesn't look like the caricature at all.
Not even close. And because of that, it gets routinely overlooked, or worse, misdiagnosed as something else entirely.
And knowing this difference, it's really crucial for you listening right now. Because if you can only spot the loud, grandiose type, the stereotypical captain of industry, then you're completely missing the other kind. The subtle, the covert, the manipulator who might seem fragile or quiet, but is actually operating just as destructively.
Sometimes even more so because it's harder to see coming.
Exactly. So we want to give you the tools to spot the whole spectrum, not just the flashy part.
Okay, so to really get started, we have to lay down the baseline, the official definition that the diagnostic community works from.
Right, the DSM-5-TR definition.
Exactly. It defines narcissistic personality disorder as this pervasive and persistent pattern, and it's built around three core things. Grandiosity, a really profound need for admiration, and a significant lack of empathy.
Pervasive and persistent, meaning it's not just a bad mood, it's their way of being.
Right. And crucially, it's got to be rigid, inflexible, showing up by early adulthood, and it has to cause real functional impairment. It affects multiple areas of their life.
Functional impairment. That's a key phrase we need to circle back to. But first, let's list out those specific behaviors. What are clinicians actually trained to look for? What's on the checklist?
So there are 9 core criteria in the DSM-5. An individual needs to meet several of these for a formal diagnosis. Let's run through them quickly.
Okay.
There's an exaggerated, grandiose sense of self-importance. Like, they think they're way more important than they are.
Yep.
An intense preoccupation with fantasies of, unlimited success, power, brilliance, maybe ideal love.
Living in a dream world, kind of?
A bit, yeah. Then there's this belief that they're unique, special, and they can only be understood by or should only associate with other special or high-status people or institutions.
Okay.
A requirement for excessive admiration, not just liking praise, but needing it constantly.
That sounds exhausting.
It is. Then, an unreasonable sense of entitlement, expecting special treatment without actually earning it.
The entitlement piece. Very key.
Huge. Then, exploiting others without remorse to achieve their own ends. Interpersonal exploitation.
Ouch.
Persistent envy of others or believing others are envious of them. And finally, displaying arrogant or haughty attitudes and behaviors, basically acting superior.
Okay, that list definitely paints that specific picture, the classic grandstanding type we talked about.
It really does.
But if we dig a bit deeper, we can kind of boil this down to maybe 3 underlying pillars of the pathology, right? That helps reveal the internal engine driving it.
Precisely. That's a great way to think about it. The first pillar is grandiosity. It's the hallmark, the thing everyone notices.
But where does it come from? It's not just confidence.
No, not at all. It's an exaggerated, often completely unfounded sense of their own importance, their talents. And this leads them to expect superior treatment, deference, even if they haven't actually achieved anything to warrant it. They just believe they're better.
And the world should just recognize that.
Right. Innately superior.
Okay, so that's pillar one. Pillar two, the need for admiration. This is where we start seeing the cracks, maybe, the fragility underneath.
Absolutely. This is critical. That constant, desperate need for validation, it comes from an exceptionally fragile self-esteem, maybe almost non-existent internally.
Wow.
So they are utterly dependent on external validation. Praise, attention, recognition, awards, anything from the outside that tells them they're okay, or rather that they're great.
That's the narcissistic supply people talk about.
That's exactly it. They need a constant stream of this supply just to keep their internal state stable. Without it, they risk collapsing into feelings of worthlessness and shame.
So their whole life is basically a performance. It's designed to get applause because they can't generate any sense of self-worth from the inside.
That's a very accurate way to put it.
Which leads to the third pillar, the lack of empathy. And this is what makes the disorder so damaging to the people around them.
Yes. This is the inability, or maybe sometimes the unwillingness, to recognize, identify with, or genuinely care about the feelings and needs of other people.
Why? Is it deliberate cruelty or?
It's more like if your entire emotional world, all your energy is consumed with managing your own incredibly fragile self-worth, propping up this grandiose facade, there's just no emotional bandwidth left for anyone else. Their needs, their feelings, they just don't register.
So that's fundamental insensitivity, that lack of empathy, it's the foundation for the exploitation.
Yeah.
And the condescending attitudes.
Exactly. It poisons their relationships because other people are seen primarily as sources of supply or as extensions of themselves, not as separate individuals with their own valid feelings.
Now, it's really important here, I think, to remind listeners about the continuum. Because we all have some narcissistic traits, right? A bit of grandiosity helps with ambition, maybe.
Healthy narcissism, yes. It supports resilience, ambition. But pathological NPD, the actual disorder, that's rare. Estimates hover around maybe 1% to 2% of the general population.
So when does it actually, tip over into being a real disorder?
Well, that's when those traits become inflexible. They're rigid, persistent across time and situations, and maladaptive, meaning they cause real problems. Genuine functional impairment or significant subjective distress.
And it affects everything. Work, home life.
Pervasiveness is key. It affects their work, their relationships, their family life, their internal sense of self. It's not just one area.
Okay. Now here's the pivot point for our whole deep dive today. If we look back at those 9 DSM-5 criteria, they seem heavily focused on the overt stuff, the observable, almost aggressive features. Assertiveness, dominance, arrogance.
Yes, very much so.
And sociocultural research connects these specific traits. Researchers call them agentic traits directly to traditional ideas of masculinity, right?
Precisely. That's the connection. These are traits historically associated with and often encouraged in men.
And this is where the systematic bias creeps in, or maybe floods in.
This is the source of it. Because the official diagnostic criteria emphasize these outward, aggressive, agentic expressions of superiority, the DSM-5 effectively becomes a tool that's primed, it's calibrated, to recognize the pathology primarily in men who present with these specific behaviors.
Which creates that devastating feedback loop we talked about at the start.
The self-perpetuating cycle.
Exactly. Yep. The male-centric definition leads to more men getting diagnosed.
Yep.
Which then reinforces the idea in society, and even among clinicians, that NPD is mostly a male disorder.
Which then makes everyone, including doctors, less likely to even look for it in women or to recognize it when it presents differently. The tool keeps confirming its own bias.
We also need to spend a bit more time on that term, functional impairment, because it's tricky.
It really is. Many people hear impairment and think failure, like they can't hold down a job or they're unsuccessful.
But our sources make it really clear that someone with NPD can be highly successful, professionally anyway.
Absolutely. They can become that successful CEO, the powerful politician, the celebrated academic. Their relentless drive, even if it's exploitative, can actually fuel that kind of achievement.
So that drive for status and admiration, the narcissistic supply, it actually pushes them towards professional competence sometimes. It doesn't always hinder it.
In many cases, yes, especially the grandiose type. It fuels the ambition.
So how do we spot the impairment then if they're sitting at the top of the corporate ladder? Where's the disorder actually causing problems?
The pathology isn't usually on the CV. It's in the connection or the lack of it.
Ah,
The true impairment is almost always hidden. It's in their private lives. It shows up as profound emotional volatility, maybe behind closed doors, chaotic interpersonal relationships, partners, family, friends who get burned, a deep-seated internal emptiness despite the external success, chronic anxiety, and fundamentally a complete inability to form genuine, reciprocal, loving connections.
so a clinical assessment really has to deliberately look past the public achievements, look for the distress hidden under that glossy surface.
You absolutely have to. You have to ask about the quality of their relationships, their internal state, not just their job title.
Okay, so we've established the standard model, the DSM model, really only captures that loud surface presentation well.
The grandiose type, yeah.
But the research is really clear now that NPD exists on a spectrum, and we need to understand the relationship between the two main ways it shows up.
Yes. And this is maybe the most crucial conceptual shift. It's critical to grasp that grandiose and vulnerable aren't really separate types or distinct diagnoses. They're better understood as two fluctuating states.
Two faces of the same coin.
Kind of. Two states that arise from the exact same core pathology, that deeply fragile self-esteem we keep coming back to.
Okay, let's start with the one the DSM-5 actually describes pretty well, grandiose narcissism, the overt type.
Right. This is the stereotype we all know. They're often extroverted, boldly assertive, laser-focused on status and power. They project this image of supreme outward confidence.
And they put others down easily.
Very easily. They actively devalue others as a way to maintain their own sense of superiority. They use arrogance defensively. And often, they genuinely seem to believe their own hype. That makes them really recognizable, especially in competitive environments like work or politics.
Okay, but then we have the flip side. The hidden face, vulnerable narcissism, sometimes called covert narcissism. Can you describe this presentation in detail? Because this is the one that gets missed.
This is such a stark contrast on the surface. Vulnerable narcissists are often introverted. They can seem shy, avoidant, anxious, deeply neurotic even.
So the opposite of the grandiose type.
Outwardly, yes. But here's the critical point. Underneath that quiet or anxious exterior, they still harbor the exact same core entitlement, the same fantasies of greatness. But in them, these are coupled with this acute, painful insecurity, a real defensiveness, and profoundly low self-esteem.
And they handle criticism differently.
Oh, completely differently. They are hypersensitive. Even a hint of criticism, something mildly perceived as negative feedback, can cause intense emotional pain, like a major injury. But instead of exploding with rage like the grandiose type might,
They withdraw or get passive-aggressive.
exactly. They often react with withdrawal, sulking, or passive-aggressive resentment, holding grudges, making subtle digs later. It's a much less direct expression of that hurt entitlement.
So maybe if the grandiose type demands attention by being the loudest voice in the room, the vulnerable type demands attention by being the most injured victim in the room or the most misunderstood.
That captures the dynamic really well.
Yeah.
Control through perceived fragility or suffering.
And what ties these two apparently opposite presentations together? You said they fluctuate.
Yes, the fluctuation dynamic. This is key. The research is becoming very clear on this. The grandiosity, that loud, arrogant state, it functions primarily as a massive defensive shield.
A shield against what?
It's a continuous compensatory effort. It's designed to ward off the underlying, absolutely intolerable feelings. Feelings of deep-seated shame, inferiority, worthlessness. The feelings that actually define their vulnerable state, deep down.
Wow. Okay, so that reframes everything. The arrogance isn't real confidence at all?
Not in the healthy sense, no.
It's psychological armor. It's a desperate defense against constant, intense internal pain.
That really is the core insight coming out of modern NPD research. NPD, at its heart, is a disorder of unstable and utterly fragile self-esteem. Their entire behavioral repertoire, the exploitation, the endless search for supply, the grandiosity, even the vulnerable withdrawal, it's all a continuous, desperate attempt to manage this chaotic internal world.
To avoid swinging between those two poles.
Right.
Feeling like a god one minute and worthless the next.
Exactly, to avoid that intolerable oscillation.
So if the grandiose state is the armor, what happens when it gets pierced? When reality inevitably crashes through the illusion? A job loss, a divorce, just getting older?
That's the moment of narcissistic injury. And it can lead to a potential collapse. When a perceived threat, and it could be a career setback, a critique from someone they value, a relationship ending, or even just the undeniable realities of aging shatters that grandiose facade.
What happens then?
Well, the individual typically reverts to one of two severe reactions. They might double down with escalated defensive grandiosity like explosive rage, contempt, immediately devaluing whoever or whatever caused the injury, lashing out. Or they might completely collapse into the vulnerable state. And this looks like extreme shame, deep depression, maybe suicidal thoughts, and often self-isolating behavior, pulling away from everyone.
Okay, given that this vulnerable presentation is driven by insecurity, it doesn't really tick the boxes for overt grandiosity in the DSM-5.
Not directly, no.
Doesn't its very existence kind of undermine the validity of the DSM-5 as the main tool for diagnosing NPD if it misses this whole other presentation?
It absolutely does. That's a central argument in the field right now. The DSM-5, by focusing so heavily on those overt agentic behaviors, systematically fails to capture individuals who primarily use introversion, anxiety, and that sort of victim stance as their main way of managing shame and entitlement.
And this flaw isn't just theoretical. It has real-world consequences.
It directly leads to the systematic underdiagnosis of a huge portion of the NPD spectrum. And as we've said, most notably in women, because their socialization often pushes them towards these less overt presentations. And when we look at the actual numbers, the prevalence rates, this diagnostic difficulty becomes really starkly clear.
How so?
Well, estimates for the lifetime prevalence of NPD, they range wildly. Some studies, usually older ones or those in very specific clinical settings, put it as low as maybe 0.5%.
0.5%. Seems very low.
It does. But then you have broader community surveys, much larger studies that find rates much higher.
Like the NESARC study.
Exactly. The National Epidemiologic Survey on Alcohol and Related Conditions, NESARC, that's a big one, it found a lifetime prevalence of 6.2%.
Okay, wow. From 0.5% to over 6%. That's more than a tenfold difference. Why such a massive gap in the numbers?
It really comes down to the methodology, how they're counting it. Studies that stick really rigidly to that narrow, grandiosity-focused DSM-5 checklist, they naturally get the lowest figures because they're essentially excluding all the covert or vulnerable presentations.
They're only counting the stereotype.
Pretty much. But these large-scale community studies, like NESARC, they often use structured diagnostic interviews that are designed to capture a much fuller spectrum of maladaptive personality traits, including the vulnerable ones. So that 6.2% figure from NESARC, it's likely a far more accurate picture of the disorder's true scope in the general population.
Okay, that makes sense. But even with that broader lens capturing more people, the gender disparity in diagnosis still seems to persist, right?
It does, yes. The official statistics, the ones usually quoted, say 50% to 75% of diagnosed cases are men.
And NESARC, even with its broader criteria.
It still found a significant difference. Lifetime prevalence rate of 7.7% for men compared to 4.8% for women. So still a gap.
So what do we make of that if the broader tool still finds more men?
Well, it's complex. A consistent finding across almost all major meta-analyses is that men do tend to score higher on average on general measures of narcissism throughout life. But again, we have to interpret these findings cautiously, always keeping that potential diagnostic bias in mind. The measures themselves might still be subtly skewed towards male expressions.
It's tangled. Okay, let's pivot to the age correlate. This I found really telling about how the disorder might play out over a lifespan. There seems to be a strong inverse relationship, right? Higher rates in younger people.
Yes, absolutely. The highest prevalence of NPD is consistently observed in the 20 to 29-year-old age group. NESARC found it hit 9.4% in that bracket.
Nearly 1 in 10 young adults? That's a lot.
Very high. And then the figure steadily declines with age. By the time you get to the 65 and older group, the prevalence drops to just 3.2%.
Wow, that's a massive drop. What explains that? Does the disorder just fade away? Do people mature out of it?
That's the million-dollar question. The decline strongly suggests what some researchers call the reality gap.
Explain the reality gap.
The idea is that those grandiose fantasies, the belief in unlimited potential, absolute uniqueness, future fame and glory, they're much easier to sustain during early adulthood. It's a time of perceived high opportunity, maybe fewer concrete failures yet, less accountability in some ways.
The world is still their oyster, so to speak.
Exactly. But as individuals age, they inevitably slam up against reality, hard limits. The career might peak lower than fantasized, relationships fail, often because of their exploitative patterns, and just the physical realities of aging, losing youth, looks, energy, these start to seriously erode that grandiose self-image.
So aging itself becomes a kind of chronic narcissistic injury.
It can be the ultimate narcissistic injury for someone whose self-worth is built on those fantasies of eternal greatness. So as this grandiose defense structure gets worn down by the cumulative weight of reality
The
checks,
pathology has to shift. It can't sustain itself in the same way.
it seems likely. The data suggests that either individuals are forced into a reduction of traits, maybe they no longer meet the full criteria for NPD as strictly defined,
Or, what's the darker possibility?
or perhaps more commonly, they shift towards a chronically vulnerable, depressed state. The core shame, the bitterness, the failure to live up to the lifelong fantasy, it takes over.
And then they get diagnosed with something else, like chronic depression or anxiety.
Precisely. Which completely obscures the original underlying NPD pathology. The disorder doesn't just vanish. It likely just changes its primary outward presentation from grandiosity to more internalizing distress.
That's fascinating and kind of sad. Now, okay, one more piece of prevalence data, marital status. This seems to confirm the relationship problems inherent in NPD.
Absolutely. The NESARC study and others found significantly higher rates of NPD among people who were separated, divorced, widowed, or had never been married compared to those who are currently married or living with a partner.
Which fits perfectly with the definition, right? The lack of empathy, the exploitation.
It aligns perfectly with the disorder's core feature. A profound, often destructive difficulty in forming and maintaining intimate, genuine, non-exploitative relationships. The instability we see in their external relationships is really just a mirror of the instability of their internal world.
Okay, so if the underlying engine of NPD, that fragile self-esteem, that grandiosity, vulnerability dynamic, is essentially the same for men and women,
Yes, the core pathology seems consistent.
then why does the behavior, the way it looks on the outside, seem so dramatically different along gender lines?
That's where sociocultural factors come in huge. The difference appears to be a kind of strategic adaptation.
Strategic adaptation, meaning
Both genders are fundamentally driven by the same need, seeking validation, admiration that narcissistics supply. But they tend to employ the behavioral scripts, the strategies that their society has historically deemed most effective and maybe most acceptable for their respective gender roles.
so they adapt their tactics to maximize the supply they can get based on what society rewards or expects from men versus women.
That seems to be exactly what's happening. It's a gendered playbook for achieving the same internal goal.
Okay, let's detail the male presentation first, the one the DSM captures well. You call it agentic and antagonistic.
Right. This presentation aligns almost perfectly with traditional, often stereotypical masculine norms. Dominance, assertiveness, competitiveness, an overt focus on achievement, status, power acquisition.
And the data backs this up.
Yes. Meta-analyses consistently show that men, on average, score higher on specific facets of narcissism like exploitativeness, entitlement, and leadership authority. Their behaviors are usually highly visible.
Like what?
Seeking status through job titles, money, expensive possessions, explicit power plays in relationships or at work. And crucially, when their grandiosity is challenged,
They react aggressively.
more likely to display overt, often explosive anger, outright aggression, using intimidation as a direct tool for control.
Okay, now let's contrast that sharply with the female presentation. This often leans more into the vulnerable side and what you call the communal sphere.
Exactly. This presentation more frequently utilizes that vulnerable subtype we discussed, and it often overlaps with traditional feminine expectations or stereotypes, things like emotionality, being relationship-focused, perhaps seeming more dependent.
So instead of overt dominance, the strategies are different.
Very different, often more covert and manipulative. The goal control and self-esteem regulation is identical, but the tools change.
What kind of tools?
Things like inducing guilt in others, passive aggression is a big one, feigning helplessness or fragility to gain sympathy or to avoid responsibility, and employing relational aggression.
Relational aggression, like social manipulation.
Precisely. Spreading calculated rumors, gossiping strategically, using social exclusion or the silent treatment to punish or control others. It's aggression aimed at damaging relationships or social standing rather than direct confrontation.
I think I see the difference now. Maybe the male narcissist says, I am powerful, so you must obey me.
A direct assertion.
Whereas the female narcissist might say, I am so wounded, sensitive, special, you must care for me, and thereby establishes control through obligation or guilt.
That captures the essence of the covert strategy beautifully.
Yes.
And alongside this, in the female presentation, we often see an intense, very specific focus on external aesthetics.
Appearance.
Yes. A hyper-focus on physical appearance, on clothing, on the meticulous curation of a perfect public image. Think about social media, for instance. And sometimes the conspicuous display or discussion of luxury goods, these all become regulated sources of self-worth.
So if the internal self is fragile, the external image has to be absolutely flawless to keep that narcissistic supply coming in.
That's the dynamic. The image becomes the substitute for genuine internal value.
Let's explore how these different playbooks show up in specific areas. Family relationships are often where this toxicity really plays out, right?
Absolutely. They are often the primary stage. In a romantic partnership, for example, the male narcissist, as we said, typically seeks dominance, wants to be the one in charge, reinforcing his status.
And the female narcissist in a relationship.
Often uses a more dramatic fluctuation dynamic. It can be intense idealization of the partner, initially perhaps seeing them as a status symbol, the perfect partner that reflects well on her. Followed by swift, sometimes brutal devaluation, sudden criticism, withdrawal, contempt. This push-pull creates control through instability. It keeps the partner constantly off balance, always trying to work their way back into that idealized phase.
That sounds incredibly confusing and painful for the partner.
Deeply destabilizing.
And what about parenting? How does NPD manifest differently there?
This is often devastating for the children involved. The narcissistic mother, particularly if she leans towards the vulnerable communal type, often views her children not as separate individuals, but as extensions of her own fragile self-worth.
Meaning the kids have to perform.
Exactly. They must achieve perfection, get the best grades, excel in sports, look perfect, be popular because their success directly validates her. It makes her look good. This can lead to intense pressure, emotional manipulation, using guilt, and often very obvious favoritism towards the child who best fulfills this role, the golden child.
And the narcissistic father.
While he can also see children as extensions, sometimes the more overtly grandiose father might view his children, especially as they get older and achieve their own successes, as rivals, competitors for admiration and attention within the family or social circle.
Wow. Okay, let's talk aggression again. We touched on this. The stereotype is male aggression, physical, dangerous, female aggression, emotional, catty, maybe less harmful. Is that accurate?
That common assumption is being aggressively challenged by the latest behavioral studies. It's proving to be quite wrong, actually.
How so?
While men are, statistically speaking, associated with more overt physical aggression across the population, the research is increasingly showing something important. Women who score high specifically on vulnerable narcissism.
The ones who seem anxious or victimized.
Yes. Those women are significantly associated with perpetrating psychological, emotional, and physical violence against their intimate partners.
Physical violence, too. That goes against the stereotype.
It does. The vulnerable presentation, with its hypersensitivity and tendency towards resentful anger when feeling slighted, can absolutely erupt into physical acts.
And that distinction between overt and covert harm is critical, isn't it?
It's incredibly important. The danger of the more typically female presentation of narcissism often lies in its insidious nature. Covert manipulation, relational aggression, psychological abuse. These are incredibly destructive.
But harder to prove, harder to see.
Much harder to identify, document, and quantify than, say, an overt act of rage or a physical assault. A persona that is outwardly soft-spoken, maybe even seems hyper-nurturing or is obsessed with being a good person, can effectively mask a complete lack of empathy and a chilling willingness to exploit or psychologically devastate others.
So the harm gets systematically underestimated. By victims, maybe even by therapists or to the legal system.
Often, yes, because it doesn't fit that expected model of the aggressive male perpetrator. The damage is profound, but it flies under the radar.
So this systematic failure, this inability of the standard diagnostic system to recognize and properly diagnose vulnerable narcissism,
No.
especially in women, it isn't just a modern clinical oversight, is it? It has deeper historical roots.
That's absolutely right. The bias we see embedded in the DSM-5, it's basically inherited. It comes from the foundational psychoanalytic theories of NPD, which were largely developed back in the mid-20th century.
Kernberg, Kohut, those thinkers.
Exactly. And their theories were developed primarily based on case studies of male patients. Patients who typically presented with those grandiose, overt expressions of entitlement.
So the theory itself was built on a biased sample from the start.
Pretty much. This created a theoretical framework that was really only marginally applicable to females who, often due to different socialization pressures, tend to present with the disorder in different ways. The foundation was skewed.
And this theoretical legacy, this biased foundation, it leads directly to what you called the most severe clinical consequence. The misdiagnosis trap.
Yes, thought trap.
What do women presenting with vulnerable narcissistic traits most often get misdiagnosed as?
The overwhelming answer is borderline personality disorder, or BPD. This is the central clinical blind spot, the most common and damaging misdiagnosis in this context.
Why BPD?
Sure.
What's the overlap that causes the confusion?
Well, the symptom overlap on the surface is actually quite substantial. Both conditions, BPD and vulnerable NPD, often feature intense emotional instability, mood swings, a pattern of chaotic and unstable interpersonal relationships, and extreme hypersensitivity to perceived rejection or criticism.
Okay, I can see how that would be confusing just looking at the surface behaviors.
Exactly. So a clinician who is perhaps overly reliant on just checking off surface symptoms, or maybe influenced by the stereotype that women are more likely to have BPD, might easily mistake the emotional reactivity and relationship turmoil of a vulnerable narcissist for BPD.
And there's research confirming that this bias actually happens in practice, like in clinical assessments.
Yes, absolutely. There are vignette studies where researchers give clinicians detailed case descriptions to diagnose. These studies consistently show that when clinicians are presented with identical case histories outlining classic vulnerable narcissistic features,
What happened?
they're significantly more likely to slap a BPD diagnosis on the patient if the vignette says the patient is female. The identical description, but labeled male, far more likely to get an NPD diagnosis or at least have NPD considered.
Wow, that's bias in action right there.
It's textbook diagnostic bias based on gender stereotypes.
Okay, so if the symptoms look so similar on the surface, the emotional instability, the relationship chaos, the sensitivity, what is the absolute key clinical differentiator? What should listeners or even professionals be looking for to tell the difference between BPD and vulnerable NPD?
This is crucial. The most important differentiator is the persistent, underlying, rigid sense of entitlement that is absolutely core to narcissism, even in its vulnerable form.
Entitlement. But how does that show up if they seem anxious or withdrawn? It's easy to spot entitlement when someone demands the best table, but covertly.
That's the key question. Covert entitlement doesn't usually scream or demand overtly. It operates more subtly. It might manifest as an expectation that others should always prioritize their needs, often masked by displays of emotional distress or victimhood.
Like, my pain is so much greater than yours, you must cater to me.
Exactly. Or expecting special treatment, allowances, or for rules to be bent for them, not because they're overtly arrogant, but because they perceive themselves as uniquely sensitive, uniquely wounded, or just fundamentally more special than others. There's still that core belief that the normal rules of reciprocity and fairness don't really apply to them.
So while someone with BPD might fear abandonment and desperately need connection, even if chaotically,
Right. The BPD fear is often about losing the other person.
the vulnerable narcissist distress comes more from the world failing to recognize their specialness and give them what they feel they inherently deserve, even if they seem insecure.
You've nailed it. The source of the distress is different. For the vulnerable narcissist, the anger, the resentment, the withdrawal, it often stems from that narcissistic injury, that feeling of being overlooked, slighted, not given their due according to their hidden grandiose expectations. They feel owed attention, validation, special care, even while presenting as shy or insecure. That core entitlement persists beneath the surface fragility.
And this brings us back to socialization again, because if a woman did try to use those loud, agentic, dominant traits that the DSM-5 actually looks for,
Society often pushes back hard.
right, she might be labeled difficult or aggressive or worse, which would just further encourage her to adopt the more clandestine, covert relational strategies to get her needs met.
Exactly. Societal pressure strongly reinforces those communal roles and penalizes agentic behavior in women. This pressure essentially trains women who are predisposed to MPD to express it in ways the DSM-5 is ill-equipped to capture. It cements the misdiagnosis cycle. The system forces the presentation into the blind spot.
Okay, so given this pretty clear systemic failure of the DSM-5 approach, the categorical checklist-based model, are there better alternatives? Are there other diagnostic frameworks being used, maybe internationally, that offer a more nuanced, perhaps less biased way to look at personality disorders?
Absolutely. There's a significant shift happening in the global clinical community, moving away from rigid categories and towards dimensional models. And the most prominent example is the International Classification of Diseases, 11th Revision, ICD-11, from the World Health Organization.
ICD-11. How is it different? How does it try to get around this bias problem?
It takes a fundamentally different approach. Instead of trying to force a patient into one specific box by seeing if they meet, say, 5 out of 9 criteria for NPD.
Which we've seen as flawed.
Right. The ICD-11 first asks the clinician to assess the overall severity of personality dysfunction. Is it mild, moderate, or severe? Just how much is this person's personality causing problems for them or others?
Okay, so severity first. Then what?
Once the overall severity level is established, the clinician then applies what are called trait domain specifiers. These describe the flavor of the personality difficulties. For narcissism, the two most relevant trait domains are negative affectivity and dissociality.
Negative affectivity and dissociality. That sounds less like a specific disorder label and more like describing underlying tendencies. How do those two domains capture the full spectrum of narcissism, including the vulnerable type that the DSM misses?
That's precisely why it's potentially much better. It focuses on the core underlying impairments rather than just the surface stereotyped behaviors. Negative affectivity essentially captures the core vulnerability.
How so?
It includes features like anxiety, emotional instability, mood swings, insecurity, feelings of inadequacy, and that high sensitivity to rejection or criticism. So the vulnerable narcissist, with all their internal distress, gets captured under this domain.
Okay, that makes sense. And dissociality. That sounds more like the antagonistic side.
Exactly. Dissociality captures the core grandiosity and antagonism. It includes features like manipulativeness, deceitfulness, callousness, hostility, risk-taking, irresponsibility, and crucially, entitlement.
Ah, so entitlement falls under dissociality.
Yes. So using this model, you can now describe a patient much more accurately. You could say they have, for instance, moderate personality dysfunction with prominent traits of negative affectivity and dissociality.
Which paints a much clearer picture. It tells you they have significant internal distress, negative affectivity, and that core sense of entitlement and willingness to exploit dissociality.
Right.
It captures both the vulnerable and grandiose elements without forcing a choice or relying on stereotypes.
Precisely. It allows for the description of that vulnerable narcissist who is both deeply insecure, negative affectivity, and feels inherently superior and owed dissociality. It's a much more flexible and potentially less biased way to describe the complex reality.
And is there evidence yet that this ICD-11 approach actually reduces the gender bias in diagnosis?
Early research is promising. Studies looking at clinician ratings using the ICD-11 framework tend to show significantly more consistency in severity ratings and trait profiles across genders compared to the DSM-5 framework. It suggests that by focusing on these underlying traits rather than specific gendered behaviors, we might be taking a major step towards eliminating that diagnostic bias.
That's really hopeful. Okay, let's shift gears slightly to comorbidity. Because in the real world, NPD rarely travels alone, does it? It usually comes with other issues.
Very rarely alone. The rates of comorbidity are extremely high.
What are the most common co-occurring conditions we see alongside NPD?
Depression and anxiety are incredibly common. Often, as we discussed, these might be triggered by a narcissistic collapse, that shattering of the grandiose defense when reality hits hard.
Makes sense. What else?
Bipolar disorder also has a significant overlap, sometimes making diagnosis tricky, and substance use disorders are very frequently co-occurring.
Why substance use? What's the function there for someone with NPD?
It can serve a couple of functions. Individuals might use substances, maybe alcohol or sedatives, to try and numb those painful underlying feelings of emptiness, shame, or anxiety, the vulnerability.
Self-medicating the pain.
Right. Or, conversely, they might use stimulants to artificially enhance their feelings of grandiosity, confidence, and energy, especially when their external reality isn't providing enough narcissistic supply to keep the facade going.
Okay. And just like the primary symptoms of NPD seem to follow gendered patterns, do the comorbid conditions also tend to show gender differences, reflecting maybe those different coping mechanisms?
They absolutely do. It follows the same pattern. Men with NPD show significantly higher rates of comorbid antisocial personality disorder, ASPD, and substance use disorders.
ASPD, that's what people used to call sociopathy or psychopathy. How is it different from NPD? They seem similar.
There's overlap, especially in the exploitation and lack of empathy, but the core motivation can differ. For the narcissist, the primary driver is regulating that fragile self-esteem, maintaining grandiosity, avoiding shame. For someone with pure ASPD, the motivation might be more about straightforward personal gain, power, thrills, or sometimes just a callous lack of concern for rules or others' feelings without necessarily needing the admiration component as strongly. These are generally seen as externalizing behaviors, acting out against the world.
Okay, and for women with NPD, What comorbidities are more common there, reflecting maybe that internalizing vulnerable pattern?
Here we see elevated rates of mood disorders, chronic depression, various anxiety disorders fitting that negative affectivity profile, and notably significantly higher rates of eating disorders, particularly anorexia nervosa and also body dysmorphic
Or
disorder.
the focus on appearance again.
Exactly. This pattern strongly reflects that intense pressure and focus on physical appearance as a primary, but ultimately profoundly fragile source of self-worth, a key part of the commonly observed female narcissistic playbook. The eating disorders, the body dysmorphia, they become clinical manifestations of that desperate struggle to control and perfect the external image to regulate internal self-esteem. It's internalizing distress focused on the body.
That paints a very clear and very concerning picture. Finally, we absolutely must return to the risk of suicidality, because the caricature suggests the narcissist is too arrogant, too self-important to ever consider that. But the data tells a very different, very painful story.
It does. The risk is extremely severe, and it's crucial to understand how it's distinct perhaps from suicidality and some other disorders.
Hmm?
When that failure, that loss, that reality check completely shatters the grandiose defenses, the resulting despair is often catastrophic for the individual with NPD. The collapse isn't just feeling down. It's a plunge into total shame, worthlessness, and inferiority. It can feel like a complete annihilation of the self they've worked so hard to project.
And the nature of the suicide attempts themselves, when they happen in this context, is often different too. It's not always what people might expect.
Critically, yes. Research suggests that suicidal attempts following a narcissistic collapse are often more planned, more deliberate, and are significantly more likely to be lethal. They are less likely to be interpretable as simply a cry for help, although all suicidal behaviors should be taken incredibly seriously.
Why more lethal?
Because the internal experience seems to be one of profound, unmanageable psychic pain, an utter devastation of their sense of self. It completely shatters that public myth of the untouchable, emotionally invulnerable narcissist. It underscores the terrifying severity of the internal anguish that can be hidden just beneath that brittle, arrogant surface. #tag outro.
So after all of that, what does this all mean for us? What's the big takeaway from this deep dive?
Well, I think the core insight really is that narcissistic personality disorder isn't just about arrogance. It's fundamentally a disorder of profoundly fragile self-esteem.
Right, where the person is locked in this chaotic, exhausting, relentless internal swing between performing grandiosity on the outside.
And feeling this terror of vulnerability, shame, and worthlessness on the inside.
In gender roles, they act like a critical filter, or maybe a director, dictating the behavioral output, how that internal struggle gets expressed to the world.
Exactly. Men are often culturally conditioned or permitted to externalize their entitlement through dominance and aggression behaviors that happen to fit the biased DSM-5 model quite well.
While women are often pressured, through socialization, to internalize their distress and use more covert relational strategies like manipulation, guilt tripping, or focusing on appearance to manage that same fragile self-esteem.
Which leads directly to them being missed by the standard diagnostic system, or worse, getting slapped with that devastating misdiagnosis of BPD.
So for clinicians listening, and maybe even for people just trying to understand difficult relationships in their own lives, the absolute key takeaway has to be, you must look beyond the loud, arrogant, masculine stereotype.
You really do. You need to consider using more nuanced dimensional models, like the ICD-11 approach, to actively probe for those signs of covert entitlement, that hypersensitivity to criticism, and the deep-seated shame that really fuels the entire narcissistic structure.
Especially when assessing female patients who present with lots of relationship chaos, anxiety, or depression. Don't just default to BPD. Look for that hidden entitlement.
Absolutely. And for society more broadly, for all of us, we really need to move past that simple one-dimensional caricature of the arrogant CEO or the boastful celebrity as the only face of narcissism.
We need to recognize that the subtle, covert manipulation, the relational aggression, the psychological damage often employed by the vulnerable narcissist,
Causes insidious and profound psychological and emotional harm, even if it's harder to spot, harder to name than an obvious temper tantrum or a physical threat. The impact is devastating.
It makes you think. We often celebrate, or at least admire, the professional success of these highly competent, powerful individuals. We see their relentless drive, their ambition, and we often label it positively.
We do. Society rewards that kind of drive.
But if that success, that ambition, is actually fueled by an exploitative, desperate, unending drive for external validation. If it's all just a fragile defense mechanism against profound internal vulnerability and shame, then you have to ask yourself this question, our final provocative thought for you to take away. Is the apparent stability and professional ambition of the narcissist just a ticking clock? And what happens when the cumulative weight of reality, aging, failure, hitting limits, losing supply, finally erodes that grandiose facade, leaving behind only the deep, potentially lethal despair?
That high rate of lethal suicide we talked about, it really reveals that the profound psychic pain hidden beneath that arrogant exterior isn't just destructive to the people around them. Ultimately, it can be utterly fatal to the self.